You are a good man with a good heart, and it is hard for a good man to be king. But it's not hard for you to get a good build for the King of Wakanda in Marvel's Avengers. I've been working on mine since Black Panther dropped, and while it might not be perfect, I certainly think there's a lot to love about it.
It keeps getting bigger.
Gravity clone, where's clone? $144K with the pounce! Before I get into it, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and come find me on Twitch and Twitter for more content. Okay, so let's talk Black Panther and how you can play him. I'm using that word very carefully because you probably already know that my belief is that the right way to play a character is always the way you have the most fun. The truth is, I've seen a lot of cool Black Panther builds already. I know a lot of people have put a lot of time into playing him their way, and honestly, I love that. There's a lot of things the character's good at. Here's what I've liked most so far. One of the first things I noticed about Black Panther is how he generates his intrinsic and what happens when he does. When that bar fills up and you double tap the intrinsic button, it's magic. Not only do you get an amazing explosion that can do a bunch of damage on its own, you do more damage to enemies while you're overcharged too. So I set up my whole build around that. Before we break down how to make it happen, let me show you what an ideal combat situation is going to look like with this build. What you're going to do is you're going to load into the map, and your first priority is getting your intrinsic bar full. Your gear will help with that, but so will Black Panther's built-in skills. All that matters is you fill up your intrinsic bar. Once it is, King's Mercy is going to apply a stack of Vibranium to whatever enemy you're focusing on, and your attacks that follow King's Mercy will battery effect off that Vibranium to do bigger damage numbers. Anytime you get low on health, or honestly anytime you feel like it, as long as you're not about to try to apply that stack of Vibranium with King's Mercy, use Percussive Blast, Black Panther's intrinsic overcharge, to damage enemies. With the right perks, you should be able to fill the bar again before the overcharge is even over. And yeah, like I said, his intrinsic overcharge, Percussive Blast, even heals him. It's especially good in those messy combat situations where you're surrounded by a lot of enemies and you're losing health quickly. Use Bast Chosen and Kimoyo beads as often as you can, and you're going to be golden. So that's the idea, and if you like what you're seeing, you probably want to know how to do it. We'll start with the skills, since by the time you hit level 50, you'll be able to set up all of this with no extra grinding. For the Kimoyo beads, I run Kimoyo Blast and Shadow Physics, which makes the beads last longer and makes the recovery beads even do a little damage. On King's Mercy, I run No More Mercy to get 3 spears instead of 1, and Your Father's Son, so every time I use King's Mercy, and well, don't miss, I get intrinsic back if it's not full already. For Bast Chosen, I use Panther's Roar to apply the Mark of Bast to all nearby enemies, making them take more damage and do less damage. And I use Ancestral Memory, so Percussive Blast does even more damage while Bast Chosen is active. For melee mastery skills, I choose Panther's Pride, Pouncing Fury, and Intrinsic Spirit. For ranged, Explosive Present, Armor Piercing, and Panther's Challenge. Intrinsic mastery skills I run are Kinetic Absorption, Kinetic Damage, and Speed of Sound. For Intrinsic Overcharge, I choose Danger on the Wind, Cool Vibrations, and Vibranium Mastery. All these perks tied together, in my experience, are what make for the best combination of intrinsic recharge and damage output. But we all know a build is not just about the skills. You need the gear too. What have I got? My slot 1 gear gives me intrinsic bursts on melee critical attacks, and my power attacks do sonic damage. Remember, Sonic is a new negative status that, once you've applied a full stack to an enemy, makes them radiate like a wireless recharge station, filling your intrinsic and heroic meters back up. My slot 2 is a battery effect ranged piece, where the first 2 daggers do shock and the third one does plasma. The first 2 perks don't help with my intrinsic meter at all, but the third makes it so that I do even more damage while overcharged. In slot 3, I run a chest piece that gives me an intrinsic burst when taking damage. I might replace this with the taking damage grants a damage buff piece if I find a good roll, but having this piece on means I'm never short on intrinsic, even when I miss a block or a parry. In slot 4, I switch back and forth between Legacy of the Ancestors, which improves Bast Chosen, and Legacy of Bast, which puts the mark of Bast on an enemy affected by Percussive Blast. Either piece is effective in this slot, and I switch them out as I see fit. For minor artifacts, I run a full Might artifact that has increased hit chance for power attacks, and an ISO of Cosmic Affinity for that health and heroic restoration. For the major artifact, I've been running the Tactagon to do more status damage. I think it's effective with the way my statuses play off of each other, but you could also consider the Ring for faster recharge of health, heroic, and intrinsic as well. As you can see from my stats, they're more even than a lot of my other builds. My main priorities were Might, Valor, and enough Resolve to stay alive, but I was intentional about putting some intensity on this build to do more status damage. Proficiency is key, too, if you want your perks to proc. Whew, that's a lot to run through so quickly, but I hope it all makes sense, and when you see it all together, I hope you're seeing the possibilities. Your Percussive Blast, which you generate from taking damage, or parrying, or meleeing, damages enemies, applies Mark of Bast, generates Intrinsic Orbs, and even heals you. Then you repeat, or use King's Mercy with a full Intrinsic bar to apply Vibranium to your enemies, which batteries with your Sonic power attacks. This build is all about flow, and using your abilities to recharge your abilities. When you get it down, you're gonna know that it feels so good to be the king. Now, there's a case to be made that this build would be a lot better with a damage buff or a Tachyon Surge, or anything that causes Black Panther to do more damage. And I agree and I disagree, because on the one hand, doing more damage is never a bad thing. The more damage you do, the more you contribute to your team, and that's great. But on the other hand, I think we're so eager to do more damage a lot of times in this game that we miss out on some really cool and interesting perks, like the one that gives Percussive Blast the ability to mark enemies with Mark of Bast. I think that's interesting, I think that's unique, and that's why I decided to use something like that instead of maybe a damage buff. I do agree that a damage buff is good, and in a lot of cases it's the right choice, but Black Panther just has so many interesting abilities and skills that I wanted to try a build without one, at least for now. That doesn't mean I'm not going to go back and put a damage buff on, say, taking damage, or a Tachyon Surge on something like defeating enemies. Any of those things could be great in this build, and it wouldn't really break the build a whole lot, because as long as you're keeping ways to generate your intrinsic, and as long as you're using Percussive Blast, I think you're on the right track for this build. But for now, I don't really have a damage buff, and I still feel good about the build, because it's a lot of fun, and it still does damage. Thanks for taking the time to watch my build video for Black Panther. I really hope you like what I've come up with for the character. And again, obviously this is not the only way that you can play him. What I wanted to do though was mess around with his intrinsic and find a way for it to be successful as a combat action in any situation. And so far I think it's working. There's still more to go on this build. I don't think it's done, but I wanted to share it with you so that way you all could work on this build as well, and then share with me what you find out grinding that you think makes this intrinsic build even better for Black Panther. Thanks again.